Chapter 4, Research Methods for Studying Mental Disorders. In this chapter, we will cover a brief overview of research methods. We will take a quick look at biological research strategies. We will look at epidemiological research, and we will end, as usual, with a discussion about contemporary trends and future directions. In this chapter, we're going to keep our discussion about research pretty broad. You may have other research classes right now, or you may have taken some classes in the past, or maybe taking classes in the future that will dive a lot deeper into these subjects. But what's most important for us to remember and take away from this chapter is that mental health disorders are complex, human behavior is complex, and therefore best understood from an integrative perspective, like we've been talking about with the multi-path model. And that applies for research as well. So researchers and mental health practitioners must be very careful to investigate all possible causes and consider alternative explanations for behavior. This chapter will help us understand different research designs and will help us evaluate reported findings. We're going to first talk a little bit about the scientific method. The definition that our text provides for the scientific method is a method of inquiry that provides for the systematic collection of data, controlled observation, and the testing of hypotheses. What is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a tentative explanation for certain facts or observations. And then we take a look at what is a theory. A theory is a group of principles and hypotheses that together explain some aspect of a particular area of inquiry or a particular phenomenon. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of replication. Replication is the repeating results under similar test conditions, and this is important for us as researchers and us as clinicians, that we're not going to accept the results of a single study or a single research study or design. We want to see the conclusions and the results from multiple studies, and those studies would have similar test conditions. And if they continue to have similar findings and results, then there becomes increased validity and reliability for those conclusions. Characteristics of clinical research. There is the development of hypotheses about relationships. There is the potential for self-correction. There's a consideration for reliability and validity. There's the use of operational definitions. There's the acknowledgement of base rates. And there's the evaluation based on statistical significance. Our text talks about these characteristics of clinical research a bit more in depth. A few we'll cover in depth in this lecture include operational definitions. The importance for research studies to use operational definitions is to provide us a concrete description of the variables that are being studied. A lot of times studies are looking at these really broad ideas. Our text talks about an example of child sexual abuse, and there could be lots of different ways that we define child sexual abuse. So it's very important for the researchers to concretely define what they are studying, and for us as the consumers of the research to have an understanding of that so that we know what that particular study is looking at, and so that we're not comparing studies when maybe they're looking both at child sexual abuse, but they have both very different definitions of child sexual abuse, and it wouldn't make sense to compare them because of that. So operational definition, very important to remember that, and if we have any questions, we can cover that in class. We talked in some previous chapters about reliability and validity. That's brought back up here. Very important for reliable and valid research. Remember, the reliability is about the consistency, so the degree to which a measure or procedure yields the same results repeatedly. And validity is about, is this measuring what we say it's going to measure? So the degree to which an instrument measures what it was developed to measure. The last characteristic that we'll take a little bit of a closer look at is evaluation based on statistical significance. The key here is to understand that there's going to be a difference at times between statistical significance and clinical significance. Their statistical significance is defined in our text as the likelihood that a research finding is not due to chance alone. So it is statistically significant. However, there may be many times where the results are statistically significant, however, not clinically significant. So example would be maybe a statistically significant score shift in a Beck depression inventory or PHQ-9 screening. However, the change wouldn't be enough to show a clinical significance in the change of symptoms. Maybe they'd still fall into more of a severe or a moderate range. And that's important to note, that just because there's statistical significance does not necessarily indicate that there would also be clinical significance. Now we will take a brief look at experiments. Experiments, or the experimental design, is the best method for testing cause and effect relationships. So some key components of a simple experiment is there's an experimental hypothesis, and there's an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable is the variable that the researcher is manipulating. The dependent variable is what is expected to change or be impacted by the manipulation of the independent variable. So a quick example here might be a study that might be interested in how sleep impacts test scores. How long you sleep would be the independent variable, and the test score would be the dependent variable in that case. Types of groups in an experiment: you will have the experimental group, the control group, and the placebo group. So when we're doing an experimental design, we have these three groups. The experimental group is the group that is exposed to the independent variable. The control group is very similar to the experimental group. The only difference is they're not exposed to the independent variable. And then we have the placebo group. Especially with studies that are looking at medication effectiveness, it would be very common to have a placebo group, and those participants would receive an inactive substance. When we talk about the placebo effect, we're talking about improvement produced by expectations of positive treatment outcome rather than actually any active substance or change in independent variable. Additional controls in experimental research. We'll take a quick look at single-blind and double-blind designs. Single-blind is where the participants are unaware of the purpose of the research, and double-blind design is where the participants and the individual working directly with the participant is unaware of the experimental conditions. And this is in an effort to control for any bias that might be present with the participant or those individuals being aware of the purpose or the experimental conditions. A quick note that some variables cannot be manipulated because of ethical concerns. There are some conditions that would not be able to be manipulated. There are certain protected populations when it comes to engaging in research. Some of those populations include children, incarcerated individuals, And sometimes when those variables are not able to be manipulated due to ethical concerns, a way to look at those same phenomena would be to use correlational studies. Correlational studies may be more appropriate in those cases, and that's what we're going to talk about next. As it relates to ethical concerns with research, any research study that you are engaging in, you need to get approval through IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board. Viterbo has an IRB, and so if you're looking at doing research as an undergrad or after your undergrad, you would submit your proposal to IRB for approval prior to engaging in any research, and that is to ensure that everything that we're doing as researchers is ethical and that we are not causing harm to any vulnerable populations. Correlational studies allow researchers to look at data from a large group to determine if variations in one variable are accompanied by increases or decreases in a second variable. And we would use a statistical analysis that would tell us if there was a correlation. When we're looking at trying to determine the correlation, we're really interested in the relationship between the two variables. This next slide here shows figure 4.2 from our text, and it shows us the different types of correlations. That first graph on the top left is a perfect positive correlation, and then on the top right we have a perfect negative correlation. On the bottom left we have the moderate positive correlation, and the bottom right shows no correlation. So a perfect positive or a moderate positive correlation shows that as we see an increase in one variable, we see an increase in another variable. A really key thing to take away from correlational studies is it's looking at the relationship between the two variables, possible relationship between the two variables, and it's not looking at cause and effect. The only type of research design that looks at cause and effect is the experimental design. Analog and field studies. The key difference between analog and field studies is that the analog studies attempt to simulate real-life situations, but under controlled situations, versus the field studies where we're observing and recording behaviors in the natural environment. Single participant studies. There are two types of single participant studies that we will review in this lecture: case studies and single participant experiments. Typically, there can be a bias with researchers that the experimental design and a study with a really large number of participants is the gold standard because of generalizability and some other key characteristics that we'll talk about a little bit later in this lecture. And that approach is the nomothetic orientation, where we study large numbers of people collectively. The single participant studies is the idiographic approach, where we have a really in-depth study of one person or one case, and it's typically used to examine a rare or unusual phenomenon. And in the field of mental health, both of these types of studies are important and can provide really important insights into how we understand behaviors and how we provide effective treatment. We're now going to take a look at the two types of single participant studies: case study first and then single participant experiment. Here we'll take a quick look at the case study. A case study is an intensive study of one individual, relies on clinical data. We can determine characteristics, course of treatment, and outcome of a rare disorder or a rare phenomenon, and it's typically used to study therapeutic or diagnostic techniques. Case studies can be really, really helpful to feed future research when we're examining a new phenomenon or making some initial guesses around therapeutic interventions and diagnostic techniques, and can lead to different kind of research down the road. And next, we're going to take a look at single participant experiments. Some aspect of a person's behavior is used as a control or the baseline for comparison with future behaviors in the single participant experiment design. There's also the multiple baseline design, where baselines on 2 or more behaviors or the same behavior in 2 or more settings is obtained prior to the intervention. There are questions about external validity, and external validity again refers to generalizability of this kind of study. Here are some of the graphs that go along with figure 4.3 from our text if you wanted to take a look at that and the text that goes along with it. Quick look at biological research strategies. There's methods for studying biological processes involved in mental illness, endophenotypes, twin comparisons, genetic studies, and study of the epigenetic processes. We're going to take a look at each of those quickly here. Endophenotypes are measurable characteristics that can give us clues regarding the specific genes involved in disorders. So, for example, as many as 80% of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia and 45% of their close relatives show irregularities in the way they track objects with their eyes. In families without schizophrenia, only 10% have this trait. And we know that schizophrenia is a severe mental illness which affects a small percentage of the population. Twin studies offer researchers a really unique way to investigate the effects of nature versus nurture and learn about environmental and genetic influences on mental health. Two key takeaways to remember about genetic linkage studies is that the goal is to determine whether a disorder follows a specific genetic pattern. And the second key takeaway is to understand the term proband. So with genetically linked disorders, individuals closely related to the person with the disorder are more likely to display that disorder. And the person with the disorder is identified as the proband. And the text talks a little bit more in depth about the concept of penetrance, and that won't be as important to know and be familiar with for this course. However, it is a really interesting concept, and our text dives a little bit deeper into it. Epigenetic research is the study of environmental factors that influence whether or whether not a gene is expressed. Builds on the idea that certain environmental factors have greatest impact during particular periods of our development. As we know that certain childhood experiences not only impact our own development and how we maybe present with specific disorders later in life, but can also impact and change the traits inherited by our descendants. And there continues to be research, epigenetic research around these topics. Animals in biological research. The use of animal models is a frequent practice as it allows researchers to better control for variables. It permits experimental procedures not practical to implement with human participants. An example of this from our text is when newborn mice are separated from their mothers, resulting in different behaviors, emotional development, and gene expression. Researchers would not be able to do this outside of using those animals. The last type of research we're going to take a brief look at is epidemiological research, which examines rate and distribution of mental disorders in the population. So epidemiological research is interested in prevalence and incidence. Prevalence is the percentage of individuals in targeted populations with a particular order during a specific period of time. And incidence is the number of new cases of a disorder that appear in an identified population within a specific period of time. We talk about prevalence frequently when we talk about mental health and when we talk about specific mental health disorders. We know that the prevalence of anxiety disorders in adolescents and youth is about a third. We know that overall prevalence of mental health disorders in adults is about a quarter. So 1 in 5 experience a mental health disorder. And that is about prevalence, and epidemiological research helps to provide those statistics for us. We're going to end just with a quick discussion about contemporary trends and future directions. Meta-analysis is a simplified process of comparing numerous research findings. And so you take a look at all of the research findings and analyze that data in a meta-analysis. There is an increasing emphasis for clinicians to implement evidence-based practices and to stay up to date with the research and with what the evidence-based practices are saying. There is a concerted effort to reduce bias and misconduct, and there's a focus on locating biomarkers and endophenotypes for particular disorders. I would also say, as it relates specifically to counseling research, there is an emphasis in utilizing case studies and single participant designs, as that gives a really rich and in-depth description about individual experiences, which can be really helpful in the clinical world. Chapter 4, Reflection and Review. We made it through Chapter 4 about research. Again, this is just a really broad overview. Take a look at these review questions. Take some time to make some notes around these review questions, and we will come back together on Monday for discussion. Looking forward to seeing you all, and I hope that you're having a great weekend.